There's a recurring dream that haunts married men, though most will never admit it exists. It doesn't come every night. It sneaks in during quiet moments when the house is finally still, when the obligations have been temporarily satisfied, when there's a brief window between the performance of contentment and the reality of constraint. In this dream, he's somewhere else entirely. Different city, different life, different version of himself that never made the binding commitments that now define his existence. He's pursuing the ambition he abandoned for stability, traveling to the place he never went because of mortgages and school districts, spending his evening doing something that actually interests him, rather than managing the endless logistics of family life. The woman in this dream, if there is one, isn't his wife. Sometimes she's someone he knew before. Sometimes she's entirely imagined. But she represents something his marriage doesn't provide and probably never did. Genuine passion, intellectual stimulation, the electric uncertainty of connection that hasn't been domesticated into routine obligation. And here's what makes this dream particularly cruel. It's not fantasy in the escapist sense where he knows it's impossible. It's memory of a fork in the road where he chose one path and is now forever wondering what the other path held, mixed with the growing awareness that the life he's living isn't the life he would design if he were starting fresh with what he knows now. Schopenhauer understood this particular form of suffering better than almost anyone, the torment of desire that can never be satisfied, the will endlessly reaching for what it doesn't have while being trapped in circumstances it can't escape without catastrophic consequences. Let's start with what nobody wants to say plainly. Marriage doesn't fulfill the promises it makes. It promises partnership, but delivers parallel lives coordinated through shared calendars and division of household labor. It promises intimacy, but delivers familiarity that breeds not contempt exactly, but a kind of comfortable indifference punctuated by resentment. It promises security, but delivers dependence where neither party can make significant changes without the other's consent, where individual will get subordinated to joint decision-making that satisfies neither person completely. Promises happiness but delivers at best contentment and at worst quiet desperation, dressed up as mature acceptance of reality. So the married man dreams of something else, not because he's defective or ungrateful or incapable of commitment, but because he's human, and humans are wired to want what they don't have, to believe that fulfillment exists somewhere other than where they currently are, to construct alternative futures that seem more appealing than their present reality, precisely because those alternatives remain untested by actual experience. Schopenhauer called this the pendulum of suffering, the way human consciousness swings between wanting what we don't have and being bored or disappointed by what we do have. The married man is caught on this pendulum in a particularly brutal way because his wants are clear. He wants freedom. He wants novelty. He wants to make unilateral decisions about his own life. He wants to pursue interests without negotiating with someone else's preferences. He wants sexual experiences that aren't the same routine encounters with the same person who's often too tired or stressed to be genuinely interested. But he can't have any of these things without destroying the structure. He's built and accepting massive social, financial, and emotional costs. So instead he dreams, and the dreams become a pressure valve for desire that has nowhere else to go, a way of experiencing alternate possibilities without actually pursuing them, a psychological space where he can be the version of himself that marriage won't allow him to be. But here's where it gets complicated, and here's where Schopenhauer's pessimism becomes almost unbearably relevant. Even if the married man could somehow access the life he dreams about, even if divorce was costless, and he could start fresh pursuing all those abandoned possibilities, he probably wouldn't find the fulfillment he's imagining. Because the dream isn't really about specific alternate choices being superior. It's about the human condition of perpetual dissatisfaction, the way we're constitutionally incapable of being content with what we have regardless of what we have. The single man dreams of partnership and stability. The married man dreams of freedom and novelty. And neither is actually happier than the other because happiness isn't a destination you reach by making the right choices. It's a mirage that keeps moving as you approach it, always promising satisfaction just beyond the next decision, the next relationship, the next major life change. This doesn't mean the married man's suffering is invalid or that his dreams reveal nothing about his actual situation. It means that understanding why he dreams of an alternate life requires understanding both what's genuinely wrong with his marriage and what's fundamentally wrong with human consciousness itself. Think about the last time you saw a married man's eyes glaze over mid-conversation about his life. Someone asks about his weekend plans, his vacation, his new project at work, and there's this moment of disconnection, this brief flash where you can almost see him mentally leaving the conversation to visit the life he actually wants rather than the life he's describing. He's answering the questions, saying the right things about family activities and home renovations and career developments, but there's no vitality behind it, no genuine enthusiasm, just the performance of someone going through motions that long ago stopped meaning anything significant. The glazed look isn't boredom exactly. It's more like resignation, the look of someone who's accepted that this is it. This is what life is now, and the dreams of something different are just dreams. Mental exercises that provide temporary relief from the grinding reality of obligation and compromise, and subordination of individual will to collective needs. Schopenhauer would recognize this immediately as the will turning against itself, the fundamental life force that drives all human action becoming trapped in circumstances where it can't express itself freely, where it has to suppress its own impulses to maintain the stability the person has committed to maintaining. The married man's will wants novelty, wants conquest, wants creation, wants risk, wants to test itself against challenges that might fail spectacularly. But his circumstances require predictability, require maintaining what's already been built rather than destroying it to build something new, require safety over excitement, require managing what exists rather than pursuing what might exist. This internal conflict is constant and exhausting, and the dreams of alternate lives are how the will reminds the conscious mind that it hasn't been extinguished entirely, that underneath the domestication and compliance and performance of contentment, there's still something alive that wants more than what it's getting. Now let's get specific about what these dreams actually contain, because they're not random fantasies. They're remarkably consistent across different men in different marriages, which tells us something important about what marriage systematically fails to provide. First, there's the dream of geographic freedom, of living somewhere else entirely, somewhere the married man chose based on his own preferences, rather than on school districts and proximity to extended family and cost of living calculations that factor in supporting dependence. He dreams of the apartment in the city where he could walk to interesting restaurants and cultural events, or the house in the mountains where he could spend mornings hiking before working on projects that actually matter to him, or the foreign country where he could immerse himself in a different culture and language and way of being. These geographic dreams aren't really about the specific locations. They're about the loss of mobility that marriage represents, the way committing to another person almost inevitably means committing to a physical location that satisfies joint needs rather than individual preferences. Second, there's the dream of professional freedom, of pursuing the risky career path he abandoned when family obligations made stability non-negotiable. He dreams of starting the company he never started because failure would have affected more than just himself, of taking the job in the different field that would have required temporary financial sacrifice he couldn't afford with dependence, of dedicating himself completely to mastering something difficult without having to balance that dedication against domestic responsibilities. These professional dreams reveal how marriage constrains ambition, how having people depending on your income fundamentally changes your relationship with risk and failure, how the married man's career often becomes about generating reliable resources rather than about building something meaningful or developing his capacities to their fullest extent. The dream isn't about the specific alternate career being objectively better. It's about the loss of agency in deciding what to do with his productive energy and how much risk to accept in pursuing goals that matter to him. Third, there's the dream of relational freedom. And this is the one that generates the most guilt and the most secrecy because it's the most direct challenge to the marriage itself. He dreams of the woman he didn't end up with, the one he was with before his wife or the one he met after, but couldn't pursue because he was already committed. He constructs elaborate scenarios where he's with this other woman, Experiencing the passion and novelty and intellectual stimulation his marriage stopped providing years ago. Or he dreams of no woman at all, of being completely free from the emotional labor and negotiation and compromise that intimate partnership requires, of making decisions based only on his own preferences, of not having to manage someone else's emotional state or subordinate his desires to relationship maintenance. These relational dreams are particularly painful because they reveal a truth the married man can't acknowledge openly, that the person he chose to spend his life with might not actually be the person who brings out his best self, that the commitment he made might have been based on limited information, or social pressure or biological impulses, rather than on genuine compatibility and mutual enhancement. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments because the dreams married men have vary based on culture and geography, what you're allowed to dream about versus what's completely foreclosed by social expectations, where there's still imagination about alternative possibilities versus where those possibilities have been so thoroughly suppressed that the dreaming itself feels transgressive. I want to map how this suffering distributes globally, where it's most intense and where there are cultural releases that make it slightly more tolerable. Fourth, there's the dream of temporal freedom, of having his time belong to himself, rather than being pre-allocated to obligations he can't escape. He dreams of mornings where he decides what to do based on his interests and energy levels, rather than based on a schedule determined by children's needs and spouse's expectations and professional demands. He dreams of evenings where he can pursue projects or socializing or solitude based on what he actually wants, rather than based on managing family logistics. He dreams of weekends that aren't consumed by household maintenance and family activities, and visiting relatives and all the other demands that marriage generates. These temporal dreams reveal how completely marriage colonizes time, how rare it becomes to have hours that are genuinely unspoken for, how the married man often feels like he's living someone else's schedule rather than his own life. The dream of temporal freedom isn't about being lazy or avoiding responsibility. It's about the loss of sovereignty over the most finite resource any of us have. Fifth, there's the dream of financial freedom, though this one is more complicated because marriage can provide financial benefits through dual incomes and shared expenses. But the dream isn't about having more money. It's about what money gets spent on and who decides. He dreams of making purchases based on his own judgment rather than negotiating every significant expense, of taking financial risks on investments or business ventures without having to clear them with someone whose risk tolerance might be completely different, of allocating resources toward his interests and development, rather than toward joint priorities that often feel more like his spouse's priorities than his own. These financial dreams expose how marriage converts individual resources into collective resources, how his money stops being fully his even when he's the one who earned it, how financial decisions become sites of conflict and compromise rather than expressions of individual values and priorities. Now here's the really brutal part that Schopenhauer would force us to confront. These dreams don't make the married man happy. They make him more miserable. Because dreaming of alternate lives means constantly comparing his reality to an idealized alternative, means measuring what he has against what he thinks he wants, means maintaining awareness of everything he's sacrificed and everything he's not experiencing. The man who doesn't dream, who successfully suppressed all desire for anything beyond his current circumstances, might actually be more content, even though he's arguably more deeply domesticated, more thoroughly broken. The dreaming man retains enough vitality to imagine alternatives, which means he retains enough vitality to suffer from the gap between actual and possible. And he can't share these dreams with anyone, can't tell his wife that he fantasizes about a life without her, can't tell his friends because they're performing the same contentment he is, can't even fully acknowledge them to himself because doing so feels like betraying commitments he made and values he's supposed to hold. Schopenhauer would say, this is the will-torturing consciousness, the fundamental life force that animates all existence using consciousness as a vehicle for its perpetuation, while ensuring that consciousness remains in a state of perpetual suffering through desire that can never be permanently satisfied. The married man wants freedom, but if he achieved it, he'd eventually want security, wants novelty but would eventually find it exhausting and wants stability, wants to pursue his individual will, but would eventually feel lonely and want partnership. There's no escaping the pendulum, no set of choices that results in permanent satisfaction, just different forms of suffering disguised as different life circumstances. But this doesn't mean all suffering is equivalent. Some forms of suffering come with agency and growth, while others come with constraint and stagnation. And the married man's particular suffering is characterized by constraint that he chose but can no longer escape without costs he's not willing to accept. Let me describe a pattern that's universal enough to be almost archetypal. The married man has a moment, usually in his late 30s or early 40s, where the dreams become so vivid and so persistent that he can't ignore them anymore. He's been married long enough that the romantic delusions have completely worn off, long enough that he knows exactly what his future looks like if nothing changes, and suddenly the weight of that knowledge becomes unbearable. He starts seriously considering divorce, starts calculating whether he could afford it, starts imagining conversations where he tells his wife he's not happy and hasn't been for years. He might even start taking concrete steps, consulting a lawyer, researching separate living arrangements, identifying which assets are his and which are joint. And then something happens that pulls him back, usually his children if he has them, or his parents' reaction if he's close with them, or his own calculation of the social and financial costs, or just his inability to pull the trigger on destroying something he spent years building even though that something isn't making him happy. So he retreats back into the marriage, but something has fundamentally changed. He knows now that he's choosing to stay rather than staying because it's the only option. He knows that he's prioritizing other values, stability for his children, financial security, social respectability, avoidance of his wife's pain, over his own desire for the life he dreams about. This knowledge doesn't make him more content. It makes him more conscious of what he's sacrificing every day he stays. The dreams become more frequent and more detailed, because they're the only place he can experience agency, the only realm where he's living according to his own will rather than according to obligations he's accepted. And over time, something hardens in him. Some essential vitality calcifies into resigned acceptance, and he stops dreaming as intensely because he's successfully convinced himself that the dreams were always impossible, that he's too old now to start over, that he made his choice and has to live with it, that wanting anything different is just immature dissatisfaction that mature people learn to suppress. This is the death Schopenhauer was describing when he talked about the extinction of the will. Not physical death, but psychological death, where the fundamental life force that makes existence vital gets systematically suppressed until what remains is a kind of animated corpse going through motions without any real desire or passion or connection to its own wants. The married man who stops dreaming hasn't achieved wisdom or acceptance. He's achieved defeat. He's successfully broken himself to the point where he no longer wants what he can't have, where he's redefined satisfaction as the absence of acute suffering rather than the presence of genuine fulfillment. And society celebrates this defeat as maturity, as him finally growing up and accepting responsibility, as evidence that he's become a good husband and father, when really it's just evidence that the domestication process is complete. But not all married men experience this trajectory the same way. And this is important to acknowledge because the suffering isn't universal even if it's widespread. Some men genuinely found partners who enhance rather than constrain them, who support their growth rather than requiring its suppression, who create space for individual will within the partnership rather than demanding complete subordination to collective needs. These marriages are rare enough to be statistical outliers, but real enough to prove that partnership doesn't have to mean the death of individual vitality. The question is how to identify these marriages versus how to identify marriages where both parties are just performing contentment while privately dreaming of alternatives. And the answer is, you probably can't from the outside. The only person who knows whether a marriage is genuinely fulfilling or just tolerable is the person experiencing it from the inside. And even they might not know because the self-deception required to maintain an unsatisfying marriage is so sophisticated that it becomes impossible to distinguish between genuine contentment and rationalized resignation. Schopenhauer would ask what the married man is actually pursuing in his dreams. what he thinks the alternate life would provide that his current life lacks. And the answer is usually some version of authenticity, of living according to his actual values and desires, rather than according to roles and obligations that were imposed externally or accepted unconsciously. The dreams aren't really about the specific woman or city or career path being objectively superior. They're about the possibility of being fully himself, of not having to perform for anyone, of making choices based on his own assessment of what makes life worth living rather than based on what maintains domestic stability or satisfies someone else's expectations. This desire for authenticity is what marriage systematically frustrates, because marriage by its nature requires compromise, requires subordinating individual will to joint decision-making, requires performing certain roles regardless of whether those roles reflect your actual self. Here's the question that cuts through all the complexity and gets to the heart of why the married man dreams of alternate lives. If you could push a button that would dissolve your marriage without any social judgment, without any financial cost, without hurting anyone, without affecting your relationship with your children if you have them, without any of the normal consequences of divorce, would you push it? The married man who immediately says no, who doesn't even have to think about it, is either extraordinarily fortunate in his partnership or extraordinarily successful at self-deception. The married man who has to think about it, who feels a pull toward pushing the button even knowing all the reasons he shouldn't, that man is dreaming of alternate lives because some part of him recognizes that his marriage isn't serving his deepest needs, that he's maintaining it for reasons that have more to do with avoiding consequences than with genuine desire to be partnered with this specific person. And this is where Schopenhauer's pessimism becomes almost therapeutic, because if you understand that no set of circumstances produces permanent satisfaction, that the human condition involves perpetual oscillation between wanting and boredom, regardless of what choices you make, then you can at least stop torturing yourself with the fantasy that the alternate life would somehow be fundamentally different. Yes, you'd experience different pleasures and different pains. Yes, you'd have different freedoms and different constraints, but you'd still be subject to the same underlying mechanics of consciousness, still swinging on the pendulum between desire and disappointment, still constructing dreams about lives you're not living, while being unsatisfied with the life you are living. This doesn't mean your current suffering is invalid, or that you should stay in an arrangement that's killing your vitality. It means you should have realistic expectations about what changing your circumstances would actually deliver. So what does the married man actually do with these dreams, given that acting on them carries catastrophic costs and suppressing them requires killing essential parts of himself? Schopenhauer's answer would be to recognize them as expressions of the will that can't be satisfied through external circumstances, to understand that the dissatisfaction they reveal isn't something that can be fixed by making different choices, but is intrinsic to conscious existence itself. This recognition doesn't eliminate the suffering, but it does eliminate the additional suffering that comes from believing that suffering is unusual or fixable or evidence of personal failure. Every married man dreams of alternate lives because every conscious being wants what it doesn't have and is disappointed by what it does have, and understanding this as a feature of consciousness rather than as a bug in your specific circumstances can at least prevent you from making catastrophic decisions based on the fantasy that grass is greener elsewhere. But I want to push back against Schopenhauer's pessimism here, because I think there's a meaningful distinction between suffering that comes with agency and growth versus suffering that comes with constraint and stagnation. The married man who's genuinely trapped, who entered marriage through social pressure or biological impulses rather than through conscious choice, who's maintaining it out of fear of consequences rather than genuine desire to be partnered, who's systematically suppressing his actual self to perform roles that don't reflect his values, that man's suffering is qualitatively different from the suffering that comes from pursuing difficult goals or maintaining relationships that challenge and enhance you. His dreams aren't just the will being perpetually dissatisfied. They're his actual self trying to communicate with his performed self, trying to remind him that he's living inauthentically, that he's betrayed his own values in service of external expectations, that he's chosen security over vitality, and the cost is higher than he wants to acknowledge. For that man, the dreams are information rather than just psychological noise. They're telling him something important about the gap between who he actually is and who he's pretending to be. And suppressing them means suppressing the last remaining connection to his authentic self. The question isn't whether to dream. The question is what to do with the information the dreams provide. Does he use them as motivation to restructure his marriage into something more authentic, even knowing that conversation will be painful and might ultimately lead to divorce anyway? Does he use them as evidence that he needs to leave, that maintaining the marriage is costing him his vitality, and that cost isn't worth whatever benefits the marriage provides? Does he consciously choose to stay despite the dreams, acknowledging that he's prioritizing other values over his own desire for authentic self-expression, accepting that cost with open eyes rather than through self-deception? There's no universal right answer, but there is a distinction between conscious choice and unconscious capitulation, between examining your situation honestly and just drifting along performing contentment you don't feel. Let me be very direct about something because I think we've been circling it without quite landing on it. Most married men will live their entire lives dreaming of alternate possibilities they never pursue, will die having never experienced the freedom or passion or authenticity they consistently imagined, will spend decades performing contentment while privately suffering the knowledge that they chose security over vitality and got neither. This is tragic, but it's also chosen. These men have agency, even if they don't exercise it. They could leave their marriages and accept the consequences, but they choose not to. They could restructure their marriages into something more authentic, but they choose not to. They could at minimum stop lying to themselves about their actual experience, but they choose not to. The dreaming becomes a substitute for action, a way of experiencing alternate possibilities without actually risking anything. And over time, the capacity for action atrophies until even if circumstances changed and divorce became possible, they wouldn't take it because they've become too comfortable with their constraint to remember what freedom feels like. Schopenhauer would say this is exactly what we should expect given that most people are cowards, that they prefer familiar suffering to uncertain possibility, that they'd rather maintain situations they know how to navigate even when those situations are making them miserable, than risk unknown consequences that might be worse. And he wouldn't say this with judgment. He'd say it as observation about human nature, about the way most people prioritize safety over growth, certainty over possibility, social approval over authentic self-expression. The married man who dreams of alternate lives but takes no action to pursue them, or even to honestly examine them, is just exhibiting normal human psychology, choosing the devil he knows over the devil he doesn't, accepting ongoing moderate suffering over the acute suffering that would come from making major changes. But here's what I want you to consider. If you're a married man recognizing yourself in this description, what are you actually preserving by staying in a marriage that requires you to constantly dream of being somewhere else? What are you protecting by performing contentment while being privately miserable? You might say you're protecting your children from divorce, but are they actually better off with parents who are just going through motions versus parents who are genuinely fulfilled? You might say you're protecting yourself from financial catastrophe, but have you actually calculated whether the cost of divorce is higher than the cost of spending the next 30 years in constraint? You might say you're protecting your wife from pain, but is she actually better off with a husband who's physically present but emotionally checked out? Who's dreaming of other women and other lives while performing devotion he doesn't feel? The protective rationalization starts to fall apart when you examine it closely, when you recognize that you might be protecting something that doesn't actually need protection, while failing to protect the one thing that desperately does need protection: your own vitality, your own authenticity, your own capacity to live according to values you've actually examined, rather than values you've unconsciously adopted. Nietzsche, who Schopenhauer heavily influenced, would say that the married man who dreams of alternate lives but takes no action is exhibiting slave morality, is accepting suffering as inevitable and even noble, rather than fighting to create circumstances that actually serve his flourishing. Master morality would say you have one life. You don't owe it to anyone to spend it being miserable. You're not morally obligated to maintain arrangements that are killing your spirit just because you once made promises before you fully understood what you were promising. This doesn't mean you should impulsively blow up your life based on temporary dissatisfaction. It means you should take your dreams seriously as information about what your actual self needs versus what your performed self has been pretending to need, and make conscious decisions about whether to restructure or exit, or consciously choose to stay, rather than just drifting along waiting for something to change, while knowing nothing will change unless you change it. So here's what you do with the dreams. You stop treating them as guilty secrets that need to be suppressed, and start treating them as data about the gap between your actual life and your desired life. You examine them honestly. What specifically are you dreaming about? And what does that reveal about what your current life lacks? You assess whether those lacks can be addressed within your marriage through honest conversation and restructuring, or whether they're fundamental incompatibilities that can't be resolved without ending the partnership. You make conscious choices about what you're willing to sacrifice and what you're not willing to sacrifice, recognizing that every choice forecloses other choices, and that's just the nature of finite existence. You stop performing contentment for other people's benefit and start being honest with yourself and potentially with your spouse about your actual experience, understanding that honesty might destroy the marriage, but dishonesty is already destroying your authentic self. And most importantly, you accept that Schopenhauer was probably right that permanent satisfaction is impossible, that even if you pursue the alternate life you're dreaming about, you'll eventually find new sources of dissatisfaction, new dreams of paths not taken, new gaps between actual and desired. But accepting that suffering is universal doesn't mean all suffering is equivalent, doesn't mean you should stay in unnecessary constraint just because freedom would bring its own challenges, doesn't mean you should suppress your authentic self just because authenticity doesn't guarantee happiness. The dreams every married man has of a life he can't have are telling him something important, not that the alternate life would be perfect, but that his current life isn't serving his deepest values, that he's living for someone else's script rather than for his own vision, that he's chosen security over vitality, and the cost is higher than he wants to acknowledge. Your responsibility isn't to stop dreaming, it's to stop treating the dreams as fantasy and start treating them as information that demands response, demands examination, demands conscious choice about whether to act or whether to consciously choose not to act while being honest about that choice and its costs. The married man who can look at his dreams honestly, assess what they reveal about his values and his current situation, and make conscious decisions about what to do with that information. That man is at least living with agency, even if he's still suffering. The married man who suppresses the dreams, who pretends they don't mean anything, who performs contentment while dying inside, that man has surrendered the one thing that makes suffering tolerable, the sense that he's consciously choosing his path rather than unconsciously executing someone else's program for how life should be lived. Write in the comments right now, I choose honest examination over comfortable delusion, because that's the first step toward reclaiming agency over your own life, toward treating your dreams as information rather than as guilty secrets, toward making conscious choices rather than unconscious capitulations. Subscribe to this channel because we're going to keep exploring what it actually takes to live authentically in a world that profits from your performance, that needs your compliance, that wants you to suppress your actual desires in service of social stability. Hit that like button, because this message needs to reach the men who are currently dreaming of alternate lives, while believing those dreams make them defective, rather than recognizing them as evidence that something essential is being suppressed. Keep watching, because what's coming next will force you to examine every assumption you have about commitment, sacrifice, and what you actually owe to the people and institutions that demand you subordinate your authentic self to their expectations. And you need to hear it before you spend another decade performing a role that's killing you, while dreaming of a life you're too afraid to actually pursue.